Okay, let's unpack this. We're dedicating this entire deep dive to a single loaded word, a word that appears kind of tucked away in the final closing greeting of the Apostle Peter's first letter, 1 Peter 5.13. And it is, I think, perhaps the most debated place name in the New Testament epistles.
It is. It's such a striking and powerful conclusion to the letter. And you're right, it so often gets glossed over as just, a footnote or a simple location marker. But it carries so much of the theological weight of the entire letter. Peter writes, "She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark."
And that one line, that single line, introduces the central puzzle that has captivated scholars and really thoughtful Christians for 2 millennia. Why Babylon? I mean, Peter is writing to believers who are scattered across 5 huge Roman provinces in what's now modern-day Turkey: Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. He's talking to churches that are mostly Gentile, and they're living under this acute pressure from the Roman Empire. So when he sends greetings from Babylon, we have to stop and really think about the options, don't we?
Precisely. Yeah, we're immediately presented with 3 major interpretations, and we have to weigh the biblical evidence for each one. So first, is he writing from the literal old Mesopotamian city, the one by the Euphrates where, a large Jewish diaspora still lived? Second, is he using Babylon as a kind of a veiled nickname, a wise name, or even a code for Rome? Rome, the imperial capital that truly dominated their world and was the source of all that pressure they were feeling? Or third, is he intentionally drawing on this huge scripture-wide symbolic picture of Babylon as the prideful anti-God world system that the prophets talked so much about, the one that culminates in the vision John records later in Revelation?
And the beautiful thing about the source material really brings out is that the word carries history, symbol, and that eschatological hope all at once. So our mission in this deep dive is to trace that word's trajectory, all the way from the Tower of Babel, through the exile, and right into Peter's first-century usage. We want to understand why Peter chose this specific name and how he uses it as a, and I'm quoting here, a pastoral signal to exiles.
And to do that responsibly, especially for thoughtful adult Christians, we really need to establish our ground rules. We have to be committed to a careful textual and pastoral interpretation. So we'll use a grammatical historical lens, which just means we have to honor the original context, the grammar Peter used, and the whole history of the word itself.
And crucially, when we get into any topic that touches on prophecy in the future, we have to maintain a clear theological distinction.
Absolutely. We have to honor the necessary distinction between God's unique program and covenants for Israel, which are still awaiting a national fulfillment, and his program for the church. The church, which lives as this unique body during the present age. Both of those narratives, Israel's and the church's, they share common elements of God's sovereignty over proud nations, but we have to keep our categories straight. And finally, this whole discussion has to maintain a focus on practical application, on enduring suffering and looking toward the future appearing of Christ. This word, Babylon, it's not academic filler. It grounds the suffering of the early church in this long biblical narrative of God's inevitable rule.
Okay, so let's begin where the biblical narrative begins. If we're going to understand the weight of this name, we have to start at its genesis. Where does Babylon first appear in the scriptures, and what lasting spiritual pattern gets established right there at the start?
The word first steps onto the stage in Genesis 11, and it's initially as Babel. This is, of course, the infamous story of the Tower of Babel. You have a unified humanity. They're all congregated on the plain of Shinar. And the text gives us their explicit motivation, which becomes the foundational pattern for Babylon. They wanted to organize themselves into a society that was resisting God's established order, resisting his global command to scatter and fill the earth.
Right, and the specific sin, the motive, is spelled out so clearly for us. They wanted to make a name for themselves and build a tower with its top to the heavens.
Yeah.
That phrase alone is so rich. What does seeking to make a name for themselves really signify for us?
Well, it reveals this deep-seated spirit of human autonomy. You have to remember the context. After the global flood, God had blessed humanity and commanded them be fruitful, multiply, scatter across the earth. So their act at Babel was a direct, organized act of disobedience. They didn't want to scatter. They wanted to centralize and unify. They were trying to achieve safety and fame and a kind of self-made immortality through collective human engineering and ambition. It was entirely separate from God's mandate. And the name Babel itself, which means confusion, is the result. God scatters them, and it shows that human pride organized against God always leads to chaos.
That initial context is the theological bedrock, isn't it? It means that Babylon is immediately established as a spiritual concept, even before it's a political location.
Oh.
It's a spirit of organized, heaven-defying pride, seeking to replace reliance on God with reliance on human systems. And that mindset becomes the lens through which we have to read every other mention of the name.
Absolutely, the theological way to set right there. So now, fast forward through history to the most definitive physical expression of this spirit, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. This is where the name moves from, a localized ancient site to a global, terrifying superpower.
And can you elaborate on that, the historical climax? How did this empire physically fulfill that Babel pattern in its actions against God's people?
Nebuchadnezzar's rise marked the definitive judgment on Judah. After so many warnings from the prophets, Babylon conquered Jerusalem. They destroyed the sacred temple, the very place of God's dwelling on earth, and carried the people into forced exile. Babylon became the fulfillment of the curse section of the Mosaic covenant, the foreign power God used to discipline Israel for their idolatry. And the arrogance, it was just so evident, not just in the conquest, but in Nebuchadnezzar's personal pride. That famous moment where he boasts, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty?" That Babel spirit, making a name for himself, was perfectly embodied in that king.
And yet, and this is so important, the exile was not just a historical punishment. It was also a place where God established a new, paradoxical model for faithful living in a hostile environment. And this is crucial for the recipients of 1 Peter, who were also exiles.
The instruction given during the exile through the prophet Jeremiah is just profound and frankly counterintuitive. While they are forcibly living under Babylon's rule, God instructs his people to settle down. He says, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, and seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf.
Seek the city's welfare. That's a directive to engage positively, constructively in a culture that literally destroyed your nation and took you captive. That's a profound challenge to both withdrawal on one hand and assimilation on the other.
It is the template for Christian existence in the world today. It really is. It's a command to be resident aliens, to participate positively in the surrounding culture, raising families, contributing economically, all while waiting for the promised restoration. The hope was rooted not in the present state of Babylon, but in God's future promise. For I know the plans I have for you, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope.
And the man who lived this instruction most faithfully, the one who provides the spiritual archetype for Peter's readers, was Daniel. Can we dive a little deeper into Daniel's example?
Daniel is essential here. He really is. He demonstrated that you could live in Babylon and even serve in its highest government tiers, literally sitting in the halls of Babylonian power without becoming a Babylon. And that famous test came early on. Daniel and his friends refused the king's rich food and wine because they would not defile themselves. And this wasn't just about diet, it was about refusing to participate in the ceremonial and ideological loyalty that the pagan state was demanding of them.
That refusal of the small corruptions, right?
Yeah.
The small compromises. That's what kept his conscience and his worship clean, even in the heart of the anti-God empire.
And it secured his prophetic authority. Because of it, he later had the spiritual insight to confront Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance, to affirm that God alone truly rules in the kingdoms of men and gives it to whom he will. And that theological realization that Babylon's power is delegated, it's limited, and it's temporary, that is the single most crucial realization for any believer living under a hostile or worldly government, whether it was Rome then or a secular system today.
Okay, so let's apply our methodology here, the grammatical historical lens. This requires us to look at the historical flow. Babylon rises, and then in a dramatic demonstration of God's sovereignty, it falls.
The fall is sudden. It's decisive. Daniel interprets the handwriting on the wall. Many in Miktekel Upharsin declaring that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. And that very night, the city is conquered by the Medes and Persians. This instant public demonstration of the transient nature of proud human power is just critical.
So why is that sudden historical fall so crucial for understanding Peter's later use of the word?
Because it allows the name Babylon to persist long after the empire is gone. The physical city, it gradually fades into history, but its prophetic shadow expands exponentially. You see, prophets like Isaiah had already used Babylon to mock the city's arrogance, describing it as claiming divine status only to be brought low. It became a universal symbol for any arrogant human power that exalts itself against the Lord. The word just accumulates the weight of God's inevitable judgment on organized pride, regardless of what nation happens to hold the title at the moment.
So by the 1st century then, when Peter's writing, Babylon carries the entire weight of biblical history. from Babel's pride to Nebuchadnezzar's conquest to the certainty of judgment. Now we can apply this weight to Peter's immediate audience and cultural context.
Yes, and we have to look at the demographics. First, we acknowledge the literal possibility. The old city and the region, they weren't completely empty. There was still a large, functioning Jewish community in Mesopotamia where the ancient capital stood. In fact, the book of Acts specifically names Jews from Mesopotamia among the worshippers gathered at Pentecost.
Yeah.
So that historical fact means that a literal interpretation, Peter writing from the physical Babylonian region in the east, we can't just dismiss it out of hand.
But the immediate overriding political reality for the scattered churches Peter addresses was Rome. The recipients in Pontus, Galatia, Asia, they're all provinces under the imperial control of Caesar.
And Rome, by Peter's day, had acquired the kind of immense economic, political, and idolatrous pomp that the old Babylonian Empire embodied. First-century believers learned very quickly how to live as resident aliens and strangers under Rome's colossal shadow. Rome demanded allegiance, it demanded taxes, and often it demanded worship of the emperor himself.
This brings us directly to the strong argument for Rome as the wise name. If Peter's identifying the sending church, the she, God's chosen people in one major city, why is Rome the overwhelmingly likely candidate for this code?
Because the spiritual and physical setting fits the message perfectly. Peter is writing to churches undergoing pressure, and he's writing from the known epicenter of that imperial pressure, using a name that prophesies the ruin of that center. Rome's unique status, its wealth, its demand for imperial worship, its political power across the globe, and its inevitable persecution of those who denied its gods. It made it the new prophetic Babylon.
So if Peter had simply written greetings from Rome, the message would have been clear, but it also would have been politically dangerous. It could have exposed the Roman Church and himself to immediate imperial scrutiny.
Exactly. Using Babylon provides a biblical shorthand, a prophetically charged nickname. It allows Peter to identify the spiritual atmosphere of the imperial capital for his readers without compromising the security of the Christians who were hosting him. Peter is defining the spiritual nature of Rome for his dispersed audience. He's saying, you are suffering under a proud world power that is destined to fall, just like Babel, just like Nebuchadnezzar's city.
So the conclusion of this historical deep dive is that Peter writes to churches scattered across the Roman provinces, and his decision to write from the center of imperial power, which would be Rome, using the charged name Babylon, just makes the most pastoral and contextual sense. It takes the abstract concept of spiritual hostility and roots it in a tangible, recognizable center of power, and that validates the experience of the scattered saints.
And that validation is so crucial. It tells them the pressure is real, but it's temporary, and it has a name the scriptures have already condemned.
All right, let's turn our attention now to how this highly significant word functions within the immediate context of 1 Peter itself. The letter is, it's essentially a powerful, enduring manual on how to live with hope and holiness and humble courage as exiles. The greeting in 5.13 is the final summary. It's the capstone on all that counsel.
The location of the greeting matters immensely. Peter has just completed his instruction on how the church must function, both internally and externally. He has addressed the elders on shepherding willingly, the younger people on submitting humbly, and all believers on resisting the devil, whom he describes as a roaring lion seeking to devour. Then, immediately after warning them about the devil's prowl, he anchors the letter. She who is in Babylon sends greetings.
That feels like a kind of spiritual counterpoint to the roaring lion, doesn't it? The lion is prowling, but Peter is safely rooted with the chosen saints right in the heart of the conflict.
It acts as both a signature and a signal. As a signature, it roots the entire letter in the physical fellowship of a real congregation, most likely the large church in Rome. It proves that Peter himself is not speaking from a place of safety. But as a signal, it reminds every reader, whether they live on the coast of Pontus or inland in Galatia, that their city, whatever its name, shares the essential spiritual weather of Babylon until Christ's return. It tells them their localized suffering is part of a much larger, universal struggle against the world system.
Okay, so now we're ready to weigh the three interpretations in light of Peter's pastoral goal: comforting exiles. If Peter intended the greatest comfort and clarity for them, which interpretation really rises to the top?
We have to evaluate them thoroughly. First, the literal Babylon option. While we acknowledge the Jewish diaspora was still there, if Peter were writing from the physical city, The designation Babylon would be, well, merely a geographical marker. It wouldn't carry the same immediate prophetic punch for the widespread churches in Asia Minor, whose primary threat, existential and political, was Rome. It just simplifies the text too much. It diminishes the historical weight Peter is clearly invoking in a letter all about suffering under authority.
And the second option, Rome as the wise name, which we already found so compelling on historical grounds.
This interpretation is the strongest pastoral and prophetic fit. It aligns with the immediate political reality. I mean, Rome was the undisputed imperial center, and it gains strong validation from later Christian writers, who commonly used Babylon to refer to Rome after its persecution of Christians really intensified.
And we also have to remember the prophetic context that would emerge later in John's visions.
Absolutely. The strongest textual support comes from Revelation itself. John describes the great city that reigns over the kings of the earth and is seated on 7 hills. That description was an unambiguous reference to Rome for any first-century reader. Peter, by using Babylon, is essentially using the same prophetic shorthand before John codified the vision.
And the third layer, the theological system. How does Babylon as the enduring anti-God world culture fit into all this?
The brilliance of the word is that the second and third options, they're mutually reinforcing. They're not mutually exclusive. Rome was the physical embodiment of the theological system in Peter's day, so he writes from the core of the empire using a biblical shorthand that tells the dispersed exiles. The pressure you feel, the demand for compromise, the expectation of idolatry. This isn't just random persecution. This is the ancient spirit of Babylon, given physical form in Rome, but impacting your city too. It comforts them by identifying their struggle using a name already destined for judgment.
And that identification, Babylon equals Rome equals the world system. That's what universalizes the struggle for us, for modern listeners. It makes the struggle relevant, whether you live in a democracy or a dictatorship.
It connects their tiny local trials to the grand sweep of biblical history and prophecy. Peter is saying, your suffering is not meaningless. It is participation in a conflict that began at Babel and will end in Revelation.
Speaking of Revelation, let's go there now. John's vision really fills in the prophetic picture that Peter only hints at. This is where the symbolic description of Babylon as the world system reaches its terrifying culmination.
John sees the concentrated end-time manifestation of this proud spirit, which he names Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. This figure is described as terribly seductive, clothed in scarlet and gold, tempting the kings of the earth. And horrifyingly, she is drunk with the blood of the saints. This final Babylon is a perfect composite picture of the world system's final stand.
What are the key elements of this final Babylon that John emphasizes? The ones that reinforce that Babel Nebuchadnezzar Rome pattern?
John emphasizes 3 main elements. First, religious seduction. She's the mother of prostitutes, which means she leads people into spiritual idolatry and false worship. Second, economic excess. Revelation 18 details the wailing of the merchants who grew rich from her excess and luxury. So the system is defined by materialism, consumption, and wealth amassed without justice. And third, political dominance. She rules over the kings and peoples of the earth, concentrating global authority and power. It is the ultimate expression of human arrogance, a unified global structure designed to sustain itself and oppose the worship of the true God.
The essay points out a powerful summons recorded in Revelation that is directed specifically at believers facing this system.
Yes, it is the ultimate call to separation. Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. This is a culmination of Jeremiah's earlier instruction to the exiles. You must live in her, but you must not partake in her spirit. You must be distinct.
And this command, even though it looks forward to the end times, is profoundly relevant to the first-century Christian. Peter's readers were facing Rome, which embodied this very system.
Exactly. Peter's use of Babylon in his greeting, it's a nod to this temporary, proud pattern. It is the necessary contrast. He reminds the exiles that their temporary home is governed by a system destined for total ruin. They belong instead to a different, eternal city, the New Jerusalem, whose builder and maker is God. The name assures them that the source of their current suffering is fundamentally unstable.
Okay, let's dedicate this section to synthesizing these concepts, making sure we fully understand the multi-layered meaning of this single word. The source material calls Babylon a thick biblical word. Can you unpack that definition for us using that grammatical, historical lens we talked about?
A thick biblical word is an idea, or a concept, or a name that just gathers layers of significance across the entire span of Scripture. It's like an archaeological dig. Every new layer adds meaning to the one before it. So when Peter writes Babylon, he's not just referring to a dot on a map. He is accessing the entire history and judgment associated with that concept. We interpret this word through three lenses at the same time. First, historically. The word carries the memory of the literal empire that conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and exiled Judah. This establishes Babylon as the empirical standard for pride that God judges. It reminds us that God uses even pagan empires as instruments, and then he judges those instruments for their own hubris.
And second, symbolically, this moves beyond the Euphrates River and into the realm of spiritual identity. It's a name for any great power, culture, or system that stands in supreme arrogance, strutting against heaven.
And this is defined by Isaiah's famous passage where he uses sarcasm against Babylon, who boasts, "I am, and there is none besides me." That statement is just blasphemous because only God can claim absolute, independent existence and authority. Therefore, any power, whether it's a political government, a financial system, or a dominant cultural ideology that claims ultimate authority, ultimate truth, or supreme self-sufficiency is operating under the spirit of Babylon. Peter saw this in Rome, and we recognize it in our own cultural power centers today.
And third, prophetically. This is the culmination in John's vision, the final, unified global system that blends all those elements together before Christ's second coming.
It is the system of religious seduction, economic excess, and political dominance that seeks to deceive the nations just before God's final, definitive judgment. So when Peter uses the word, he is saying to his readers, the power that currently dominates you, Rome, is an incarnation of the ancient, proud foe, Babel, and is destined for the final judgment, Revelation. That layered meaning provides deep theological comfort and clarity.
That clarity is particularly important when we discuss prophecy. This brings up a critical question that is so vital for thoughtful adult Christians to consider, especially when dealing with prophecy. How do we keep our theological categories clear between God's distinct plan for Israel and his plan for the church when the word Babylon appears in both narratives? The essay mentions the dispensational perspective.
This point is paramount because confusing Israel and the church confuses the whole biblical storyline. We maintain the distinction that Israel, as God's chosen national people, and the church, a new body formed of both Jew and Gentile in the present age, have separate, though related destinies and operating covenants.
Can you maybe explain the difference using a clear metaphor, just to help listeners understand their status as the church versus Israel's status?
Okay, think of it this way. Israel was given specific, earthly covenants promises concerning a land, a king, and a throne, which still await a literal, future national fulfillment. The church, on the other hand, is defined by Peter as a pilgrim people, as exiles. We live in the world, but our citizenship is heavenly. The church is waiting for the chief shepherd to return and receive us to glory. Israel is waiting for the Messiah to return and restore the nation and take up the Davidic throne.
So how does Babylon factor into those two distinct but connected timelines?
Babylon's past dealings, specifically the 70 years of exile, are primarily Israel's story. That was a specific discipline under the Mosaic covenant. However, Babylon's future in Revelation intersects with the church's witness now and with the specific timeline of judgments, Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks, that precedes Christ's literal global reign. The judgment of the world system is a necessary precursor to the establishment of the kingdom that Christ will rule.
So it sounds like Babylon is the common enemy, the recurring antagonist that opposes God's people in every age, whether they're Israel or the church.
Exactly. The source of opposition is the same. Organized human pride. And the end result is the same, God's infallible judgment. The difference is just in how that judgment relates to the specific covenants.
We should probably briefly address the differing expectations for Revelation's final Babylon, which often causes confusion.
Indeed. There are two primary expectations for Revelation 17 and 18. One view, often associated with a literal historical reading, expects a literal rebuilt city to rise in the Middle East, reviving the economic and political power of the ancient location. The other view, which I think is most compatible with Peter's usage, sees Revelation's Babylon as the concentrated, final, spiritual and economic system of worldwide evil, using a specific city like Rome in John's day as its historical model.
But regardless of which literal location is chosen, the essential theological point remains unchallenged.
The point is that God will infallibly judge the proud world order in its final form. He will deliver his people, fulfill his promises, and gather a vast multitude from every nation to worship the Lamb. The pride of Babel, whether manifest in Nebuchadnezzar's empire or the final global system, is marked for destruction.
Pulling back one more time to Peter's immediate letter, why does identifying Babylon as Rome serve such a powerful pastoral purpose for the original suffering readers?
It serves multiple purposes that really anchor the letter's encouragement. Firstly, it validates the experience of the scattered believer. By writing from Babylon, Peter shows he is not speaking from theoretical safety. He is standing inside the imperial pressure cooker that is causing their suffering. This shared experience creates an immediate bond and authority.
And secondly, it elevates their suffering from just a localized political issue to a cosmic prophetic conflict.
Yes, the identification anchors the core messages of the letter. It reinforces that their suffering is not random, but is participation in Christ's own suffering. They are instructed to live as exiles, to conduct themselves honorably under Roman rule, to honor rulers without granting them ultimate lordship, and to expect fiery trials because the world system is inherently opposed to Christ. Their faithful endurance will be followed by eternal glory.
So by using this name, Peter is effectively telling his readers, you are not fighting against a temporary policy or a bad emperor. You are fighting the ancient, doomed spirit of organized human pride.
It's a masterful move of pastoral communication. It really is. It teaches them to recognize the ancient foe in modern dress, equipping them to live faithfully in any city, in any culture that roars like a lion and shines like a counterfeit light.
All right, as we transition into application, which is always the most important segment for our listeners, we need to translate this weighty theological analysis into everyday Christian decisions. We're looking for practical, actionable lessons. Let's start with lesson 1, living where we are.
The first practical lesson Peter gives us through this word is the need to consistently recognize and identify Babylon's feel in our modern cities and culture. I mean, whether we live in a global financial center, a tech hub, or a place focused on entertainment, these systems inevitably prioritize the same things Babel prioritized: human power, projected image, instant pleasure, and self-sufficiency.
Right. And when a believer insists on moral absolutes, or truth rooted outside the self, or holiness in public, they are often treated with suspicion, hostility, or even contempt. That feeling of being a resident alien or a cultural outsider is the spiritual marker of Babylon's atmosphere.
It is the spiritual weather forecast. It tells us that our location, no matter how politically or economically free it appears, still feels like Babylon because this present age operates under systems that have not yet openly bowed to Christ's visible rule.
So if the immediate response isn't fear or cultural isolation, Peter's advice from the exile, that steady path, becomes incredibly important. How do we engage positively without being corrupted?
We meet the pressure of Babylon with the compelling quiet of Christ-like behavior. Peter prescribes this step by step. Do good in public, so that when they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God. We honor the authorities even when we disagree for the Lord's sake. We maintain a clear conscience. And we are always prepared to explain the hope we carry, but with an essential mix of gentleness and respect.
So the idea is that the visible good works of the Christian are the antithesis of Babylon's self-serving pride.
Exactly. Let's think about specific, contemporary application points. In a culture driven by social media and self-promotion, the modern equivalent of making a name for themselves, the believer has to let their speech be truthful and humble. Where systems encourage shortcuts or deceit for professional advancement, we must refuse the small corruptions, those little moral corners we might be tempted to cut that buy security or status.
And critically, the act of worship itself is the act of resistance.
It is the ultimate refusal of Babylon's idols. Where money, status, and pleasure demand supreme allegiance, we must keep our worship unshared. We cannot serve both God and mammon. We cannot devote our best energy and affection to the pursuit of Babylonian success and then reserve the leftovers for God. The faithful refusal to worship Babylon's gods, to maintain singular devotion to Christ, is the first, most fundamental act of resistance for the Christian exile.
That brings us directly to lesson 2. Do not be charmed by the world's shine. Babylon is often described in Scripture with stunning, seductive imagery, gold, precious stones, fine linen. It's the seduction of wealth, spectacle, and power.
This is the danger of organized human achievement when it's divorced from God. It is beautiful, but it's deadly. We have to return to that powerful end-times command from Revelation, "Come out of her, my people." And this command is primarily about internal orientation, not just physical location. You may have to live in the city, but you must evacuate Babylon from your heart.
So, if we are not leaving our jobs or our neighborhoods, how do we pull our desires away from the specific, destructive loves that power the spiritual system of Babylon?
We have to identify the specific loves that fuel that system. Pride, luxury without mercy, sensuality without covenant, and profit without justice. Babylon promises life, fulfillment, and freedom through these things, but it always delivers death and slavery. The Christian must actively cultivate desires that move in the opposite direction, towards simplicity, generosity, and purity.
What does this internal modern coming out look like on a daily basis for the thoughtful listener?
Well, it looks like contentment that actively resists the consumerism that feeds envy. We must practice radical generosity that loosens the grip of wealth, proving our security is in God, not in our assets. It demands spiritual and digital purity that refuses to engage with media or content that degrades the human soul or cheapens covenant relationships. And perhaps most practically, it means dedicating our time and energy, ensuring that our focused time of rest and worship does not become merely another opportunity to accumulate status or fleeting self-centered pleasure. Our security is in eternity, not in maximizing the temporal.
We have to acknowledge that this path of refusal is costly. When Daniel refused the king's food, he risked his life. When Peter's readers refused to worship Caesar, they risked persecution. This path requires profound courage and endurance.
It demands courage because the Babylon system inevitably canalizes those who refuse to conform. It means enduring social awkwardness, professional stagnation, or even the loss of certain opportunities that come from simply telling the truth or holding to biblical standards rather than capitulating to the cultural mood of the moment. But Peter balances this cost with a powerful promise of endurance. We know the God of all grace will restore and steady us, even after we have suffered only a little while. Our temporary loss is balanced by his eternal, secure promise.
And that promise of endurance naturally leads us to our third lesson, loving the global church. The greeting itself, "She who is in Babylon sends you greetings," emphasizes the immediate fellowship across vast geographical regions.
This is such a beautiful and vital reminder of global connectedness. Peter is connecting a congregation in the imperial capital, a place of severe suffering, to scattered, persecuted saints across Asia Minor. It universalizes the fellowship, and it reminds us that no believer is facing the pressure of Babylon alone.
In our modern context, where distance is so easily overcome through technology, what are the practical applications of this necessary act of love for the global church?
Active love means that we actively pray for our brothers and sisters who live under governments far harsher than our own governments that embody the spirit of Babylon through direct oppression and violence. It means giving sacrificially to gospel work where the cost is high and where the opposition to Christ is acute. And it requires us to remain humble enough to receive encouragement from those saints who suffer well, letting their endurance and clarity shame our own complaining or self-pity when we face milder trials.
So the ultimate defense against the spiritual pressure of Babylon, then, is not individualism or isolation, but a shared global stability rooted in the grace of God.
Exactly. We have to focus on standing fast together in the true grace of God. The danger for the exile is always to look for an easier path. A novelty that offers crowns without crosses, a compromise that promises peace without truth. Peter insists there is no painless Christianity when you are living in Babylon's shadow, but there is a shared, sustained, and promised strength.
And the final encouragement that anchors this entire application section is the reminder that the chief shepherd is coming.
When your own city or cultural climate feels overwhelmingly heavy, remember that the global family of believers is enduring the very same spiritual weather. The promise remains. The chief shepherd will soon appear with an unfading crown of glory, and the temporary pressures of Babylon will vanish forever. That is the hope that sustains the exile until the end. So, to summarize this extensive deep dive, Babylon in 1 Peter 5.13 is far more than a simple location. It is a thick biblical word that serves three essential functions for the suffering church. It remembers the historical city that judged Judah. It is used as a wise name for Rome, the proud power of Peter's day and the central source of persecution, and it signals the final system that will rise and inevitably fall before the Lamb reigns openly.
And Peter uses this layered meaning to provide his exiles with a profound lesson on spiritual living. To live as chosen strangers in the world, doing visible good, carrying quiet courage even in the face of suffering, and ultimately standing fast in the truth of God's grace.
So for you, the thoughtful believer listening today, the framework is set. Do not be surprised when your home or your culture feels like it operates under Babylon's familiar spirit of arrogance and autonomy. Do not be seduced by Babylon's spectacular shine, its promise of easy luxury or unshared authority. And critically, do not attempt to navigate Babylon's streets alone. Stand fast with the global church that shares your hope.
So what does this all mean? The proud world system, the spirit of self-exaltation, will pass away and face ruin. The eternal city of God will not. Cast your anxieties upon the God who cares for you. Resist the enemy with a clear mind and wait with absolute certainty for the God of all grace to intervene personally.
Peter assures us of this steadfast hope as he closes his monumental letter. Let's return to the passage that grounds all of this endurance and patience, 1 Peter 5:0-11.
And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. To him be the power forever and ever. Amen.
The main encouragement there is the assurance that the suffering is temporary. It is only for a little while. But the result is eternal. God's promise is to personally intervene, to restore, to strengthen, to make you firm, and to make you steadfast. That assurance of God's personal commitment to his suffering people is sufficient for every pressure Babylon can apply. May the God of all grace make you firm and steadfast as you live as chosen exiles today.